In a courtroom ruled by prejudice, a young black attorney fights to save a single mother from a false conviction. A racist judge dismisses the evidence. But what starts as injustice sparks protests, topples careers, and changes the system forever. What happens next will shock everyone. But let's start at the beginning. In the dimly lit courtroom of Greenville County, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Judge Samuel Klein, a tall man in his 60s with a face carved by years of wielding power, presided from his bench. His robes, perfectly pressed, seemed to amplify the cold authority he exuded. Above him, the state seal cast an imposing shadow, as if reinforcing the weight of the biased judgment often dealt within these walls. Seated at the defense table was Clara Bennett, a young black civil rights attorney whose sharp features mirrored her determination. Her tailored navy suit contrasted against the drab gray walls, a silent testament to her professionalism and resolve. Beside her sat Monique Hayes, a 29-year-old single mother, her trembling hands clasped tightly on the table's edge. Her dark brown skin was marred with faint bruises on her arms, remnants of the excessive force used during her arrest. Her tear-filled eyes darted nervously between the jury and Clara, silently pleading for justice in a system that had seldom granted it. The charge against Monique was ludicrous, stealing $47 worth of groceries from a local store. Surveillance footage clearly showed her holding a receipt and calmly loading her car. Yet, the police insisted she had looked suspicious. Their subsequent decision to tackle her in the parking lot, leaving her humiliated and injured, spoke volumes about their true motivations. Clara had uncovered the arresting officer's history of racial profiling, but Judge Klein dismissed her motions to introduce it as evidence, calling it irrelevant. As Clara stood to deliver her defense, her voice was calm, yet unwavering. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about theft. It's about systemic bias, about targeting black women like Monique Hayes, who are just trying to live their lives." Her words resonated, and for a moment, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Klein's gray eyes narrowed, his lips curling in disdain. He raised his hand, silencing Clara, mid-sentence. "Stick to the facts, Miss Bennett," he snapped, his tone clipped. "This is not the place for your political agenda." Despite repeated interruptions, Clara pressed on, exposing inconsistencies in the police testimony. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, clearly affected by her arguments. Yet, the judge's closing remarks swept away any doubt. "The law is clear," he stated with finality, his tone almost instructive. "Trust the word of law enforcement, or chaos reigns." The jury returned quickly, and the verdict was as expected: guilty. Monique's muffled sob echoed in the courtroom as Clara gripped her shoulder, the weight of another unjust conviction heavy between them. Clara stormed out of the courthouse, her heels striking the marble floor with the force of her fury. Her mind raced, replaying the verdict over and over, each iteration fueling the fire in her chest. The sun outside was harsh, but the glare of camera flashes was harsher. A crowd of reporters swarmed her like vultures, microphones thrust forward in a cacophony of overlapping questions. "Miss Bennett, what's your response to the verdict?" one shouted, shoving a recorder dangerously close to her face. Clara stopped abruptly, turning to face the sea of cameras. Her dark eyes blazed with righteous indignation, her expression a storm of outrage. "My response?" she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. She took a step forward, her tone rising. "This is not justice. This is an execution of bias." Her words rippled through the crowd, the reporters momentarily stunned into silence. Before they could recover, Clara pushed past them, her fists clenched at her sides. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and determination. Monique's tears, the smug satisfaction on Judge Klein's face, and the apathetic jury haunted her as she marched toward her car. Over the next week, Clara buried herself in research, her small apartment becoming a battlefield of files, notes, and highlighted articles. Late into the night, she pored over public records, court transcripts, and community complaints. What she found was both enraging and damning. Judge Klein's history of disproportionately harsh rulings against black defendants, often based on dubious evidence or flimsy testimonies. Statistical patterns emerged, impossible to ignore. His conviction rate for black individuals was nearly double that of white defendants in similar cases. Clara dug deeper and discovered something even more sinister. Financial records revealed ties between Klein and the local police union. Large donations had flowed into his re-election campaigns, raising questions about his impartiality. Armed with this explosive evidence, Clara went to the press. Major outlets seized the story, headlines blaring phrases like "racial bias in Greenville courtroom" and "Judge Klein's corrupt ties to police." Social media erupted in outrage. Hashtags like #CorruptJudgeKlein and #Justice for Monique trending nationwide. Protests soon followed, with hundreds gathering outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. Clara stood in the crowd one afternoon, her face resolute. The system had tried to silence her, but now her voice was part of something much larger, a movement for justice. The air outside the courthouse buzzed with chants and the rhythmic pounding of signs against the pavement. Protesters gathered daily, their voices echoing through the city streets. "Justice for Monique," they shouted in unison, their cries a rallying call for accountability. Banners demanding the removal of Judge Klein and an end to systemic racism blanketed the square, creating a powerful visual of resistance. Inside, Clara Bennett was relentless. The stacks of documents on her desk grew daily as she pored over records, compiling every shred of evidence to submit to the newly convened independent judicial review. She reached out to fellow attorneys, some hesitant, others eager to expose Klein's decades-long pattern of bias. Statements poured in, detailing how the judge had dismissed critical evidence, unfairly ruled in favor of law enforcement, and handed down disproportionately harsh sentences to black defendants. The pressure was immense, but Clara thrived in the fight. Every late night spent researching, every meeting with Monique's family, every appearance on national news fueled her resolve. When Monique's appeal reached the appellate court, the entire nation watched. This time, with Klein's glaring misconduct under scrutiny, the appellate court overturned the conviction. The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Monique Hayes stood at the defense table, trembling as the words sank in. "The conviction is overturned," the judge declared. Clara immediately enveloped Monique in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down their faces, the weight of the injustice momentarily lifting in a flood of relief and gratitude. But Clara wasn't finished. She filed an ethics complaint against Judge Klein, detailing his misconduct and citing clear racial discrimination. Investigators uncovered damning evidence, documented connections to police brutality cases, campaign donations from the local police union, and consistent rulings favoring white defendants. The public demanded action, and the state's Judicial Council made a historic decision. Judge Samuel Klein was disbarred, stripped of his authority and reputation. The news sent a clear message. Corruption and racism in the judiciary would no longer be tolerated. As Clara stood outside the courthouse, watching the protesters cheer the announcement, she knew this victory was not just for Monique. It was for every person silenced by an unjust system. 1 month later, Clara stood in the same courthouse, but this time, she wasn't arguing a case. She wore a sleek black robe, her hair tied neatly back, and her smile radiated confidence. The room was packed with supporters, from civil rights activists to Monique, who sat beaming in the front row. I, Clara Bennett, swear to uphold the law with fairness and integrity, she declared, her voice echoing through the hall. The governor himself had appointed Clara as the first black woman to serve as president of the Greenville County Court. Her meteoric rise symbolized the community's hunger for justice and change. As Clara took her seat at the judge's bench, she looked out at the crowd. This wasn't just her victory. It was a win for every person who had been silenced, wronged, or oppressed. And while there was much work to be done, Clara vowed to ensure that no one else would endure the injustice Monique had suffered. The courtroom erupted in applause as Clara's journey from advocate to arbiter of justice reached its triumphant conclusion.